So in this video, we're going to discuss very briefly how emotions develop, focusing in on that fear response, and then discussing the role of the amygdala in this fear response, and a little bit about the role of the amygdala in anxiety. We will touch on the topic of the amygdala and anxiety more in a later video. Hopefully, you went through the module and you reflected on that Inside Out clip and how the movie Inside Out suggested that emotions develop. The movie really focused in on the idea that emotions are innate, that certain emotions like joy and sadness, they're there from birth, and that other emotions develop when needed at a specific designated time. Now, as we saw with the theory of constructed emotions with Lisa Feldman Barrett, this isn't the case. Emotions, according to the neuroscience of emotions, don't seem to be innate. They seem to be more constructed in the moment and a result of experience. So when we think about joy and the question of, is joy really present in infants from birth? Let's think about when babies actually have social smiles or when they have their first smile. Sometimes people will even say that smiles can be detected in babies while they're still in the womb. However, those smiles obviously aren't in response to social cues. They might be hearing something or seeing something, but most of the time you see that smile like during an ultrasound. Well, nothing is really going on socially. You may have heard that these smiles are in response to gas bubbles. You see these in newborns even. As soon as they're born, sometimes you'll see a little smile. But again, they're not really focusing on anything. They're not in response to social cues, which is what joy would represent or happiness would represent. So in the first 6 to 8 weeks, infants are really just taking everything in. They're learning how to move those facial muscles to produce different facial expressions. They're learning to mimic us. They're watching us. They're watching our facial expressions because that's really a important way about how babies learn. And so the first smile really isn't until around 6 to 8 weeks of age, sometimes a little later. So this picture here is of my daughter, Carrie, and this was her first smile that was caught on camera. It was probably about 10 weeks old, even though I think she was smiling earlier than that. And you can see it's not just a smile, right? This is a full facial smile. It's in response to something socially, some social cue. You can see her eyes are sparkling here. They're squinting. They're smiling with that mouth smile. And that's different than just a gas bubble smile. This is showing true happiness, true joy. Now in the clip and in the movie, they probably really depict fear developing about the right time developmentally, because fear can't develop, or doesn't develop, I should say, in children until they have the ability to run away from that fear. Because it wouldn't really be, okay for an infant to have a fear of different things when they can't get away from it. So if you think about little Albert, if you think about that classical conditioning experiment where if you condition him to be afraid of the loud sound, when they looked at everything, he was about 9 months old, he wasn't afraid of anything. He wasn't afraid of the furry objects. He wasn't afraid of the clown mask. He wasn't afraid of all these different things, not even fire. The only thing that made him cry was the loud sound. And so again, having that fear response when you can't get away from it really isn't, I guess you would say, fair to a baby. So fear doesn't develop until the infant is able to escape that fear. However, infants do have something called the moral reflex, which just kind of resemble a fear response. So the moral reflex is when you hear a loud sound, they arch their back and they extend their limbs crying. Now, this again is one of those newborn reflexes you might have learned about in a developmental psychology class, and it's present from birth, but it disappears between 4 and 6 months old. The idea is by 6 months old, this response is gone, and then you don't see something like this again until that fear response starts to develop. Now, if this moral reflex is retained, it is implicated in an overactive fight or flight response, anger issues, anxiety issues, disorders like oppositional defiant disorder, autism spectrum disorder, and ADHD even. Now, after infancy, we have a startle reflex. So think about how when you hear something that startles you or you're afraid of, what happens to your body? What tenses up the most? Your neck muscles tense up. So that's part of that moral reflex, and those neck muscles are tensing up that we've inherited from lower animal species. Because if you think if your neck tenses up, that's where the prey is going to go for the kill, right? And it's the tenser your neck, the harder it's going to be to get in and actually make that kill. So our neck tenses up when we are afraid. So when we hear a loud sound, the pons are going to tense our muscles up in our neck. That's that startle reflex. And that's going to occur within 3 to 8 milliseconds. And then the amygdala is going to enhance that startle reflex. So the amygdala is part of that fear response. So here we can see showing you different parts of the amygdala, the central amygdala, the basolateral amygdala. And the amygdala is a small almond-shaped structure that sits kind of at the end of the hippocampus within the temporal lobe. Now, the amygdala is going to receive sensory input from the central amygdala is going to receive sensory input from the lateral and the basolateral amygdala. It's going to send output to the central gray area of the midbrain, which is going to relay information to a nucleus in the pons that's responsible for that startle reflex we were just talking about. Now, damage anywhere along this route from the amygdala to the pons interferes with learned fears that modify this startle reflex. Now, cells in the amygdala also get input from a variety of different areas. You can see here, there's input from pain fibers, vision, hearing, and this is all going to allow the amygdala to help activate that fight or flight response, preparing the body for action to escape danger if needed. Now, there's different paths through the amygdala responsible for the fear of pain, fear of predators, fear of aggressive members of the same species. And research suggests that the amygdala is not just isolated to fear responses. While it controls these avoidance responses, because when you're afraid of something, right, you want to avoid it, other pathways seem to respond to positive stimuli and control our approach responses. So there seems to be dual pathways from the amygdala to control these avoidance and approach responses. Now, that's too much for us to really go into in this introductory to biological psychology class, but in the past I did incorporate a little bit of information about these behavior activating and inhibiting systems here as part of my discussion on emotion, but I've decided to kind of go in a different direction in recent semesters. One thing that's important to note is that in humans, damage to the amygdala does not result in the loss of emotions. And again, we'll talk more about the role of the amygdala in anxiety. Just the idea, keep in mind that it's an overactive amygdala that seems to play a role in anxiety, as well as perhaps a lack of feedback from the prefrontal cortex to control that fear response that we see in anxiety and anxiety disorders.